play sports, if we want to have. Oh,
sorry.
No worries, no worries. So I'll take. In fact, I'll take.
I just realized that I had forgotten to resume it after we kicked off the meeting, so I apologize.
No worries. Yeah. So why find an alternative to turf in the first place? And I think it is important to recognize that turf does have its place in our society and our culture, where it's a great area for recreation and gathering and play. And if you have pets, you certainly want an area where they could run free, roam, and even use the bathroom. But it is important to remember that even despite some of the benefits that turfgrass has, it does have drawbacks. And that's related to what we call inputs. And when I say inputs, I want you to think of the management that's required to keep a healthy stand of turfgrass in one's yard. There are three main types of inputs that I'm really going to focus on here. One is fertilization. So when we fertilize our yard, our grass, we're generally applying two key nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. When those run off the landscape, so if you apply fertilizer and then we have a rain event and there's stormwater runoff, those have the potential to bring that nitrogen, that phosphorus, to nearby bodies of water and cause what we call eutrophication, or algal blooms in bodies of water. When this happens, you get that kind of green, murky aesthetic to it. And what then happens is the oxygen is sucked up by the plants. There's less oxygen available for the wildlife in the body of water. And overall, the lake or river or whatever body of water it is that's being, where this nutrient loading is occurring, it becomes overall less palatable for recreation. We also use a lot of water to maintain our turfgrass areas. So irrigation is a major thing that we think about when it comes to improving the sustainability of turf. I'll talk a lot about how we can manage turf specifically for reducing irrigation needs. And we also expend lots of fossil fuels. Every single time we mow, we're expending fossil fuels, and I'd imagine all of us know the effect that that has on our environment. If we think about global warming and climate change, one of the main reasons we see that coming is the use of fossil fuels. And every time we mow, we're expending fossil fuels. So we'll be thinking about how can we reduce mowing on our own home landscapes. This also ties directly into species selection. And something that I like to focus on that's a little bit more novel, a little bit newer in the world of turfgrass science and the management of our yards, is that many of our yards, especially our turfgrass lawns, really lack ecological function. So when I talk about bee lawns and some other options, I'll talk specifically about how we can bring ecological function, our pollinators, our insects, our wildlife, back to our yard and manage turfgrass areas. So I think it's important to have a little bit of context here, where turfgrass covers about 50,000 square miles just in the continental US. So the lower 48, all of our states minus Hawaii and Alaska. This is good for about 2% of the US, of the continental US that is, meaning that 1 in 50 steps you take in the US is likely on turfgrass. And when we think about where turfgrass is most prevalent, the map on your left can really help to visualize that. So all of these green spaces on the map, those are areas of high turfgrass prevalence. And you see a lot in our big metro areas like in the Northeast and in Southern California. But it's important to note that the Twin Cities are no exception to this, and really Minnesota on the whole. Anywhere on this map where you see that spattering of green within Minnesota, that represents an area of high turfgrass prevalence. So what we want to do is we want to figure out how we can either A, find an alternative to the turfgrass that we're using so much, or B, try to figure out how we can manage it in the most sustainable way possible. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to run through a few different options. We're going to start with the options that are the most familiar to a traditional turfgrass lawn, where it's all about species selection. So I'm going to talk about the low maintenance turfgrass options that exist. Then I'm going to move on to kind of what I think is a nice middle ground between what humans want and what our ecosystems want out of a lawn area. And I'll talk about pollinator-friendly lawns. You may also hear these referred to as bee lawns or flowering lawns. And then I'm going to go to the most ecologically friendly option, but kind of the least familiar option, and that's our perennial ground covers. You'll notice L2L in parentheses after the second and third option. That means that these are options supported by the Lawns to Legumes program. The Lawns to Legumes program is a program for Minnesotans that was just renewed on the first day of the state fair, where it provides funding directly to residents to help with turf lawn conversion projects. Do note that your conversion has to be to a pollinator-friendly alternative. That's why the low-maintenance turf is not included, but the pollinator-friendly lawns and the perennial ground covers are considered L2L projects because they benefit our pollinators. So let's jump right into the meat of things and think about, oh, and I do want to recognize the partners that make this possible, of course. So the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Recreation, I mentioned Lawns to Legumes. They help to lead and administer that program, as does Blue Thumb and Metro Blooms. So if you are interested in that program, do a quick Google search for Lawns to Legumes, or you could visit the Bowser Lawns to Legumes website or the Blue Thumb website. And if you want a little bit of help, financial assistance or technical assistance, installing one of these turf alternatives, you could definitely find those on the Bowser website, the Metro Blooms website, or the Blue Thumb website. So I'm going to go over each of these three options, starting with the one that will be most familiar to a traditional turf grass lawn, and that are these low maintenance lawns or low input lawns. So when I think of low maintenance turf, here what we have to recognize is we're going to have a little bit of a trade-off where you can manage these to be, almost identical to your traditional turf grass lawn. But if you really want to maximize the sustainability of your lawn, if you really want to reduce those inputs of fertilizer, water, and mowing, you are going to have to be willing to accept, a slightly imperfect lawn appearance. What I'm asking you to do is be willing to prioritize ecological health over a perfect aesthetic. Also, what I encourage you to think about throughout the entirety of this presentation is how much do you use your lawn, where each of these options differs in how much traffic they can tolerate. So the more familiar options, especially the low maintenance turf, those can tolerate a significant amount of traffic. They'll be pretty similar to what your current lawns can tolerate. But as I go on to talk about things like perennial ground cover, then we are going to start to sacrifice lawn function and recreation a little bit. So you'll hear me use the term low maintenance or low input quite a bit throughout this presentation. And these bullet points, in particular, the first three bullet points are what I really want you to key in on. So when I think of what makes a turf grass stand or really any stand of vegetation low input, we want to reduce three things. We want to reduce irrigation. We want a drought tolerant surface. The more drought tolerant the surface is, the less water we have to apply to it, and the less potential there is for stormwater runoff, and the more we're conserving our highly precious natural resource that is water. We also want vegetation with a slow vertical growth rate. This ties directly to mowing, where the more slowly our grass grows, the less frequently we have to mow it. In just a few slides, I'm going to talk about some turf grass options that can reduce your mowing to maybe 2 to 3 times per year, as opposed to the general American lawn that's mowed probably once every 7 to 10 days. We're also going to be thinking about low fertility needs or lawns that have a low nitrogen requirement. Kentucky bluegrass lawn, the most common turf grass species used in home lawns in Minnesota in northern climates, it needs a lot of fertilizer to stay green and beautiful and dense. We're going to try and think about how we can reduce the amount of fertilizer we apply to our lawns, because so much of that fertilizer runs off of our lawns. The nitrogen and phosphorus are then brought to nearby bodies of water, and it creates that eutrophication, those algal blooms I was just talking about. Thinking about disease resistance and insect resistance for a turf grass species, that's something that we really leave to our turf grass science labs, where we want our stands of grass to be as disease resistant as possible, and we want them to be able to fend off things like grubs. But that being said, there's not much that a homeowner can do or a resident can do on the management end for those two things, aside from, maybe thinking critically about the species that you're using, trying to stay up to date on recommended species and cultivars across the board. So I do think it's important to recognize the environmental benefits of turf grass, especially in a low input lawn. So here what we're thinking is, if we want a surface in our home landscapes that are ideal for recreation, let's try and make those as environmentally friendly as possible and think about the environmental benefits that exist within that kind of a landscape. I think that first bullet point there, preventing soil erosion and stabilizing dust, that is really the big ticket winner there. Where the main reason that I think it's important to have a dense, thorough stand of turf grass is because of the potential for soil erosion and runoff that occurs when you have bare soil on your lawn. So the roots of turf grass, even though they're relatively shallow, they still help to stabilize the area and prevent a lot of soil erosion from taking place. They also conduct filtration. There's all sorts of contaminants that would otherwise run off our surface as stormwater runoff, but our green plants are able to filter out a lot of those contaminants from our ground and surface waters. Like any other green plant, they do release oxygen and conduct carbon sequestration. That being said, our native plants tend to do a little bit of a better job of this, but any green space is better than no green space, and turfgrass does conduct this to an extent. There are also some other benefits like the moderation of air temperature, where if you've heard of the urban heat island effect, or this general premise that our urban and suburban areas tend to be warmer than our more rural or areas with more natural plants, that's because of the amount of impervious surface or hard surfaces that don't allow water to penetrate. So having turf grass, water can penetrate and naturally cools our air temperature. And also cities can be noisy, but having vegetation in place can certainly help to reduce that noise. So turf grass definitely provides a benefit there. And when I think about how to manage a turf grass lawn for sustainability, the most important thing you could do is think critically about species selection. And by far and away, the best thing you can do is start to use fine fescue or tall fescue turf in place of Kentucky bluegrass. So fine fescue, the reason I recommend it is because it checks all three of those boxes I was talking about before, with regards to fertilization, with regards to irrigation, and with regards to mowing frequency. So let's start with fertilizer needs. And I'm going to be comparing this to Kentucky bluegrass, as about 80 to 85% of lawns in the state of Minnesota are planted with Kentucky bluegrass, and that's something we really want to change. So the fertility needs. So Kentucky bluegrass, you're generally supposed to apply about 3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet to a Kentucky bluegrass lawn. Comparatively, fine fescue, you're only required to apply about 1/2 of a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet throughout the course of a year. So that means that fine fescue has 1/6 the fertilizer requirement as compared to traditional Kentucky bluegrass. This will go an incredibly long way in reducing the nitrogen and phosphorus that runs off of our lawns during a rain event. Fine fescue is extremely slow growing. You might have heard of no-mow grasses. Those no-mow grasses are just mixes or blends of fine fescues, where fine fescue has a much more slow vertical growth rate than a traditional Kentucky bluegrass lawn. I'll talk about that growth rate a little bit more in just a couple slides, but it's definitely something to consider, especially if you want to reduce the amount of mowing in your lawn. That third bullet point, shade and sun tolerance, is really interesting to discuss. This is actually the reason that your fine fescue grasses initially came to prominence, where folks wanted a turf grass that would do well under dense, heavy shade. And fine fescue does really well in full sun, but it also does really well in shady conditions. And that's how we first started to use this. These other benefits related to sustainability, related to reducing our resource use on a lawn, are kind of something that we found out later on and that we're now trying to breed for. So a grass that was initially bred for shade tolerance is now being bred for reducing inputs. Fine fescue has great winter hardiness. I would say that it's important to note that it's a little bit slower to green up coming out of winter. So if we have a harsh winter and we have the snow melt and you see some folks' lawns starting to green up, but yours is lagging behind a little bit, just be patient. Your fine fescue is fine. It's just a little bit slower to green up in the spring. And also reducing irrigation. Fine fescue, as well as tall fescue, another really sustainable good turf grass, it has a much deeper and complex root system as compared to Kentucky bluegrass. Because of that, you don't have to water it nearly as frequently. The University of Minnesota has what they call rainout shelters, and what those rainout shelters do is they restrict the access of water to our lawns. So they've done tests where they see how long can a turfgrass species go without having irrigation applied. Most Kentucky bluegrass lawns can go 7, maybe 10, some really good ones, maybe 14 days before they start to brown up and you see a loss of quality. Fine fescue grasses, some of them can go up to a full month before you start to see a loss in quality. I do turfgrass consultations throughout the summer, and this summer we had a really intense drought. I can't tell you how many lawns I saw that were planted with Kentucky bluegrass that were dead or dying, while the fine fescue lawns were still in really high quality condition. And that is directly tied to their deep root systems, their ability to access water deep in the ground, and their low irrigation needs. Some drawbacks of fine fescue that you should be familiar with is it does have relatively lower traffic tolerance. That doesn't mean that you can't walk in your lawn, play in your lawn, etc. It's more so if you're having really intense activity in your lawn, maybe you've got kids running around there playing soccer, if you've got several dogs with sharp nails that run in it a whole lot, that abrasion, the cutting from the nails, can cause some issues. That being said, this doesn't mean that you can't use fine fescue in a lawn that receives a lot of traffic. It just means that you're going to want to mix in another turfgrass species alongside the fine fescue that does fine in the face of traffic tolerance. So consider mixing in maybe 10 to 20% of either tall fescue or Kentucky bluegrass if you know that your lawn is a highly trafficked area. Snow mold fine fescue is susceptible to snow mold, so if you happen to be allergic, just keep that in mind. So no-mow mixtures, these are highly popular. So let me talk a little bit about how a no-mow mixture of fine fescue works. And I'll start off by comparing it to all those other species of turfgrass that tend to be popular. So most species of turfgrass, they grow straight vertically, whether they're at 1 inch in height, 3 inches in height, 6 inches in height, or 12 inches in height. Fine fescue would be the exception, where with fine fescue, what happens is once it reaches about maybe 5 or 6 inches off the ground, just like in the picture of your right, it starts to lay over yourself and form this beautiful kind of wavy pattern. Because of that, you are able to mow it far less frequently. Where this is a picture taken right at the University of Minnesota's Alderman Hall, one of the ag campus sites, and they have a beautiful fine fescue lawn that they mow maybe once or twice per year. Something that you should take note is that your mowing practices are going to be different. Because we're allowing the turfgrass to grow much taller, we are going to need a high quality mower that can get through taller heights. So if you're letting your turfgrass grow out to 6, maybe even 8 inches, you're going to want to cut your lawn in passes. So you don't go straight from 6 inches to 3 inches. You go from 6 inches to 4 inches. You wait a little bit, then you go from 4 inches to your desired lawn height. So you're going to do your mowing in passes rather than cutting all at once, because you're letting it grow longer and you're mowing much less frequently. Here's some other pictures of no-mow mixtures, no-mow fescue, just out in nature. The one on the right is also from the St. Paul campus at the University of Minnesota. The image on your left is just from a random site in Minneapolis, where a resident decided, hey, I'm making the change from Kentucky bluegrass over to fine fescue.
Hey, James, it looks like we have a question from one of the participants.
Yeah, let's hear it. And I would say if they want, they could even turn their microphone on to ask it, or they could put it in the chat, whatever their preference is.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Natalie. In the last slide, it said no ryegrass. Could you talk about that?
Yes. That actually is from the former extension agent at the University of Minnesota. His name is Sam Bauer. Fantastic scientist and a friend. He is really proud that this lawn doesn't have ryegrass. So perennial ryegrass is a species that's commonly used on sports fields, and it's included in lots of turfgrass mixes because it germinates so quickly. Mm-hmm. That being said, it is a very low quality species. So what Sam wanted everyone to know is that this species is up and healthy and green, and there's no ryegrass included. Mm-hmm. We don't recommend using ryegrass. Well, when I was in the turfgrass lab, and we still don't recommend the use of ryegrass in home lawns because it's a lower quality species. It doesn't do well during a hard winter. It doesn't do as well during the droughts of summer. Where you'll see it used is if you go to a Twins game, target field is planted with ryegrass because the outfielders can cut up that grass all they want. You put down some more seed, it's up and green within 3 days. That being said, if you want a grass that's resilient and sustainable, ryegrass is not your friend. So these lawns that Sam established with fine fescue, he would be happy that I'm telling you that they are ryegrass free because they are a lower quality species.
Thank you.
You are welcome. So the biggest change that I've made to this presentation over time is people have told me, great, we're sold on fine fescue. It's a fantastic product. How do we actually install it? So I do want to get our hands virtually dirty here and think about how we can go about installing one of these low input lawns. So there's 2 options that residents have. You can either seed these fine fescue lawns, or you could install them as sod, where sod is that kind of like laying out a carpet of turf grass. There's benefits to each, and I'll cover them. So with regards to seeding, there's a much greater availability of different species and cultivars. Where sod production, it takes a little bit more technical knowledge, it takes a little bit more savvy. so there's fewer species available in sod. That being said, there is some fine fescue on the market as sod, and it is becoming increasingly popular. Seed is also much less expensive to install as compared to sod, and you generally see stronger root development. The reason for that is once the sod is cut, it starts to gradually decline in health. The highest quality sod that you can install is the second you cut it, is the second you install it. So the faster you can go from the sod production site to your lawn, the healthier you'll get, the stronger root development you'll get. With seed, since they're never cut out, you don't have to worry about that. And with seed, because there's greater species availability, it's much easier to adapt your seed selection to different site-specific deficiencies. If you know that you're dealing with a shady area, you could pick the most shade-tolerant subspecies. If you know there's going to be wear damage present, you can pick the most wear-tolerant subspecies. With sod, I think the benefits are rather obvious. You get rapid establishment, you get a rapid green up, you put that green carpet down and it looks beautiful the very next day. It's also really great on sloped areas. It can be very difficult to establish a lawn from seed on sloping areas. All it takes is a little bit of wind or a little bit of rain and your seed could be washed away, where your sod is going to stay in place. Seed is also very picky as to when you put it down to establish it, whereas sod, you can really put it down any time of year as long as you give it ample water. So anytime I talk about installation, whether it's for a turf lawn or a native planting or a rain garden, I always like to talk about the importance of a soil test, where when I'm going to get a new planting established, it's important to know the quality of your soil. There's a few key things that you want to think about. You want to think about your soil pH, whether it's acidic, basic, or just right. You want to think about your nutrient levels, here what you're keying in on our nitrogen, phosphorus, and even to an extent potassium. And you also want to think about soil organic matter. And that last one, the percent organic matter, is really the area where we tend to see the most deficiencies in Minnesota soils. Where in farmland, it's very rare that you're going to see nutrient deficiencies in farmland soils, but percent organic matter is really the winner. Where if you have a percent organic matter below 3%, you want to think about introducing some compost, or a compost tea, something that's going to bring your organic matter back to your soils. That being said, across the board, the overall point that I always recommend getting a soil test, and these are like 15, 20 bucks, is because it helps aid you in selecting the proper site of soil amendment for your site. So, for example, you know that your soil is deficient in nitrogen. You could select a nitrogen-rich fertilizer. If the soil test reveals that your site is deficient in organic matter, you can pick a compost that is full of organic matter. That's going to bring organic matter back to the soil. So, timing. When it comes to seeding, I would say the number one reason I see these fail is because of timing. I can't tell you how many folks have come to me asking why their turfgrass lawn installation has failed, and it's because they tried to do it in the middle of summer when it's 90 degrees out and where really just about everything struggles to grow. So I'm going to go through the different windows of time that are beneficial for turfgrass establishment. The first window of time, and the window that we're just at the end of, is the late summer. So generally between August 15th and September 15th is a fantastic time to start a new lawn. The reason for that is because of the ambient temperatures that we're experiencing. Turfgrass and really lots of northern climate plants, they grow best between temperatures of 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. If you look at our forecast of the next 10 to 14 days, and you look at what we've just been experiencing, our temperatures for the majority of the day are right in that range, which means it's great for turfgrass establishment and growth. When you do a seeding in the late summer, you will expect same year germination and establishment, where you'll get green up before things go dormant in the frost. I always like to recommend doing a little bit of an overseeding. When you establish a new lawn, it's almost inevitable that there's going to be some patchy areas. So try and see what areas are struggling and sow in a little bit of seed either late in the fall as a dormant seeding, and I'll talk about a dormant seeding very soon, or the following spring during what we call the spring green up. So a dormant seeding, another window of time that I really like to recommend. This is in the late fall, and what you're looking for is early to mid-November. What's really important here is soil temperatures. We want the ground to be cold, but not yet frozen. An ideal soil temperature is about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. With this, what's going to happen is the seed is going to lay dormant, as the name implies, through the winter, and it'll start to germinate and truly establish the following spring. The reason that this is such a great practice, dormant seeding, is because it makes your turf grass more competitive. So turf grass establishes and grows based on what we call growing degree days, or an accumulation of warmth. If you do a dormant seeding, it helps to ensure that once the temperatures start to warm in the spring, your turf grass is collecting those growing degree days, and it has a competitive, and it's not at a competitive disadvantage over whatever weedy species might be in your soil. Similar to all other establishment techniques, we do recommend keeping some seed behind for an overseeding based on patchiness. And don't worry about snow. Snow cover is actually going to aid in the establishment here. So a little bit more about a dormant seeding. So why not in the late winter? The reason for that is if you try to do this as an overseeding where you're dormant seeding directly over the top of your pre-existing turf, that mowing event is, and you're supposed to mow before every overseeding, the mowing event is going to kill the grass that's present within the landscape. So why not in the late winter? It's because the ground is frozen. Your plants are going to really struggle if you mow at that time. So you want to refrain from mowing during that time of year. Why not in the very early spring? And this is still an option, but it's not exactly my favorite option. The reason for that is because once it warms, the weed seeds in the ground are going to start accumulating those growing degree days, and they'll be at a very little bit of a competitive advantage over the turf grass that you're trying to establish yourself. So you still can do this during the spring greenup or in the spring, but I really prefer the late summer, early fall seeding or a dormant seeding, where an early spring planting is kind of my third favorite option. Across the board, as long as you avoid the dead heat of summer, you should be fine. So how to actually seed this, where believe it or not, there actually is a little bit of science behind how you install the seed. So we recommend what's called a perpendicular seeding. So most turf grasses are going to ask you to seed at a rate of 4 to 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. So with a perpendicular seeding, what you're going to do is you're going to spread half of the seed while walking in the north-south direction. You're going to spread the other half of the seed while walking in the east-west direction. After you spread that seed, you're going to very lightly rake in the soil. We're not trying to bury or submerge it. We're just trying to lightly get a dusting of soil over the top of that seed. So directly after that initial seeding, you're going to do one heavy watering. That's to make sure that your soils are fully saturated. After that, you're going to implement a light watering program. The Turfgrass Science Lab at the U talked about this very thoroughly at their field day that I just recently attended. Your goal is to apply only a 1/4 inch of water per day. So what they want you to do, though, is they want you to water frequently. So a low amount of water, but a frequent watering, such that you're keeping that uppermost layer of the soil moist throughout the day. So I would say at least 2 to 3 times per day when your new lawn is getting established. If you can do more, that's great. When it comes to sodding, the most high quality sod you can get your hands on is new sod. You want to install directly after it is cut and delivered, ideally within 24 hours. Before you lay the sod down or before the contractor lays the sod down, you want the soil to be nice and moist, so water before they arrive. Ensure that the edges of your your sod, your little grass rugs match up nicely. And if there is some mismatches, fill that area with some cracks or even a little bit of turf grass seed. If you want to ensure that your sod is actually establishing, you can do a quick, simple test called the tug test. You just pull on those blades of grass. You could even get your fingers in and pull on the edge of the sod. If you feel resistance, your sod is establishing successfully. So fescues are the most grass-like option, but there are more native grass-like options, such as sedges and native grasses. So sedges are...
James, before you continue, can I just butt in with a few questions from the crowd?
Absolutely.
Okay, so 2 questions that are related to if you have an existing lawn, do you have to start from scratch or can you overseed into the existing lawn? The second, the kind of variation on that is what if you have an existing lawn, but it's extremely weedy? What is your recommendation? And then
Sure.
the third question is, if you are doing that November dormant seeding, how would you go about watering if your irrigation system is already turned off?
Yes, great questions. I'm going to do these one at a time. And Angie, I apologize in advance because I might ask you to repeat that.
Yep,
So the
no
first
problem.
question is the first question was overseeding versus new lawn renovation, correct?
Yep.
Does it have to be a new lawn renovation? And it actually ties directly into the second question.
Yep.
If you have a healthy turfgrass lawn that's not overtaken with weeds, you can absolutely establish a new species via an overseeding. So fine fescue, because it's much more low input than other traditional species like a Kentucky bluegrass or like a perennial ryegrass, what you can actually do is lay down the turf seed directly over the top of the existing species. When you do that, you're going to want to cut the existing species as low as possible and rake away the clippings. That's just to ensure that your fescue seed is able to make contact with the soil. You're going to want to water it and do everything I said through establishment. And once it's established, you actually want to, in a sense, neglect your lawn. You want to limit its access to fertilizer. You want to limit its access to irrigation, and you want to let it grow nice and long. The reason for that is because when you do these things, you're creating conditions that are favorable for the fine fescue and unfavorable for the Kentucky bluegrass. So with that, using those methods, you can allow the fine fescue to overtake the Kentucky bluegrass over time. This leads right into that second question where, what if my lawn is completely overtaken with weeds or even just moderately overtaken with weeds? If there's a heavy weed presence in your lawn, it's going to be really difficult to establish something new. Generally, weedy species are more aggressive, more competitive than turfgrass species or even like the flowers that I'm going to talk about when I talk about bee lawns. So there, I would recommend a new lawn renovation. And what was the third question? Oh, dormant seeding and watering.
Yep. Well, and then we have a kind of an add-on to that. So one is if you're doing dormant seeding, watering after your irrigation system is turned off, but also in a number of our communities, they have watering restrictions right now due to the drought. So, you know, what would be the recommended course of action right now?
Yes. So I'll start with the dormant seeding one, where that one is really easy.
Okay.
So the seed, once we lay it down in early, mid, late November, we're actually not even going to touch it. It's not supposed to establish until the following spring.
Okay.
So what you do is you hold back on your watering until the spring green up the following year, and then you start hitting it with that light and frequent watering program. So at least 2 to 3 times per day, looking for a 1/4 inch of water in total, watering as frequently as possible. Watering restrictions are absolutely something that's difficult when establishing a new lawn. Some areas do have an exception where if you're establishing a new planting, they'll lift those rules. So what I would say is to read through your city's code or your county's code. If they have that exception, then you can certainly do this while still applying water. If there are no exceptions, then you really do have to wait until a year where we're not experiencing this horrible drought. This is the exception, not the rule to Minnesota summers. It's going to be much easier to establish a new lawn in other years where we don't have this crazy intense drought.
Yeah. All right. One last question. Are there any concerns about wildlife eating the seeds over the winter if you're doing dormant seeding?
Yes. And what you would want to do is you would want to apply some sort of like a covering, some sort of perhaps like a mulch or a straw blanket or a germination blanket. And that'll limit the ability of birds and other wildlife to access the seed. That's a great question.
All right. Carry on.
Okay, so slight variations on traditional turfgrass, or not even that slight. Honestly, these are fantastic options outside of traditional turf, where there's sedge species and native grasses that you could use in place of traditional turfgrass. Pennsylvania sedge, fox sedge, ivory sedge, plains oval sedge. These are all native grasses that are well adapted to our landscape, our climate, meaning they're going to be very low input. They won't need any, or they'll need very little, if any, fertilizer, water, etc. The thing to take note of is they are much more expensive to produce. Here's Pennsylvania sedge in beautiful, sunny, dry conditions. It does extremely well there. And there are even options for shady conditions.
like a Plains oval sedge, like an ivory sedge. Honestly, I even see Pennsylvania sedge do pretty well in shade. The only drawbacks to these options is that they can be costly. And the reason to that is related to production. So it is going to be a financial investment in the short term, but because they're so sustainable, you might end up saving money in the long term based on how little fertilizer and how little irrigation you're applying to these landscapes. Some other possible grass species to take note of are prairie June grass, buffalo grass, tufted hairgrass, blue grama, and side oats grama. The prairie June grass is a really interesting one to take note of. The U of M's Turfgrass Science Lab has specifically highlighted this grass as a species that they think has really high potential for inclusion in lawns as a low input option. So even though availability is low now, they're actively working to try and increase availability of this species. So just keep your eyes out and keep your ears open for scuttlebutt about prairie June grass. So yeah, these are potential options that are ultra low maintenance, but right now with their availability, they are going to be more expensive to install on day one. So this is normally where I would stop for questions, but Angie, if there are no new questions, I could jump right into that second option, the pollinator-friendly lawns.
Yeah, I don't see any new questions that have come in. Sorry, we kind of jumped the gun on the questions.
That's fine. I don't really have, it doesn't have to be super structured. I'll take any questions whenever they come in. I think a couple are actually popping in right now.
Yep. One question about being able to view the presentation later. I'm recording and I will post it to our Conservation District YouTube, and I'll send out a link along with resources to everybody who registered for the workshop. Another question about where to buy seed. Is that something that you will be talking about in the presentation, James?
Yes. So at the very, very, very end, when I do acknowledgements, one of the links that you'll see is to the University of Minnesota's Turfgrass Science page. And they have a very thorough and extensive list of different turfgrass seed providers throughout the entire state of Minnesota. So if you're joining us from the county, or maybe if you're joining us from way up north, as they say, there'll be a seed provider near you. Yeah, so lots of great options. I love to work with Twin City Seed. They do mostly larger sites though. So tons of great options nearby.
Awesome.
So let's talk about pollinator-friendly lawns. And here are the questions that we're thinking of is, are we willing to kind of change our schema, our, kind of perception of what a turf lawn should look like? Where generally with a turf lawn, we think of anything flowering in it as a weed. What I'm encouraging you to do with these pollinator-friendly lawns, with these bee lawns, is think of any of the flowers that grow within a lawn as pollinator food, as something that's going to support your local ecosystem, your pollinators, and all other forms of wildlife. If you have areas of very high use, you're playing soccer, you're playing games, a bee lawn or a pollinator-friendly lawn might not be the best fit. But that third question is really where I think the key to all of this is, and that's, do you want to turn your lawn into a functioning ecosystem? Where the primary benefit here is that we're bringing wildflowers back to the lawn, and that brings back all of the pollinators and wildlife that come with that. So what I ask all of you to do is kind of alter your perception of what the perfect turfgrass lawn looks like. Where here on the left, this is what would traditionally be viewed as a very high quality lawn. It's dense, it's green, but when I look at this, what I see is a monoculture. I see turfgrass where maybe it's a mix or a blend of different turfgrass species, but here we're trying to actively discourage the presence of flowers. On the right, what we've done is we've created a landscape that works for both humans and pollinators, where this is still walkable, it still works for recreation, and it has a similar aesthetic to a traditional turfgrass lawn. But with these flowers that we're including, we can also support a ton of pollinator species. So the function of a bee lawn, it keeps all of those low maintenance characteristics. You're still using fine fescue, you're just adding some wildflowers to the mix. So what's new is you're adding in ecological value. So you're maintaining the traditional aesthetic and function associated with a turfgrass lawn. Now what we're doing is we're enhancing these lawns to also support wildlife, specifically our pollinators. One really great study out of the Chicago area that I love to highlight is that a research team out of the Chicago area found that converting just 5% of a traditional turfgrass lawn can improve pollination at local urban gardens and local urban farms. So if you want to promote local food production, you want to support your local growers, gardeners, farmers. If you like going to the farmers market on Sundays, Saturdays, um, making a small change, converting just a small section of your traditional lawn to something flowering can really help out local food production. So when we were building these bee lawns, we did it quite literally from the ground up. And we had to think critically about what species are going to work within a bee lawn, what flower species that is. And we needed the flowers to check a few boxes. So first, they needed to be able to establish in Minnesota soils. Everywhere you go, there's different kind of zones with different soil types and different nutrient compositions. We need to find the plants that work well here. Second, we only wanted to use flowers that serve as high quality forage for our wild bees. This means pollen that has high protein content and nectar that has high sugar content. And finally, as best we could, we wanted to incorporate native flowers into the mix. This ended up being a little bit more difficult than we anticipated, but there are still some options here. So I want to talk about each of the flowers that we had success with in these pollinator lawns, in these bee lawns. So self-heal is a beautiful purple native flower that does really well within the setting of a turfgrass lawn. It's got these medium-sized kind of beautiful whorled blooms. And what's really of notice here are these long floral necks, or the corolla of the flower, where this actually dictates the types of bees that are able to use this flower. Our hypothesis was that only larger bees would be able to use this flower. And that's because when you have a long floral neck, you generally need a long bee tongue to get in there and get resources. This species is thought to be primarily a nectar source, and it does well in full to part sun, and it likes moist soils. So as you get your planting established, do try to hit it with some water to support the self-heal if you go about establishing a bee lawn. Another flower that's included, and this is kind of functions opposite of the self-heal, at least from the pollinator's point of view, is creeping thyme. Where with creeping thyme, we have these small, wide open blooms that lends itself really well to our smaller bees. Andrenid bees, ground nesting bees, Laceoglossum, a type of sweat bee. We see small bees all over this flower. The one that I see most often are bees from the species Chlorella. If you ever see those small, beautiful, iridescent green bees out on wildflowers, they absolutely love creeping thyme. Creeping thyme is extremely well adapted to Minnesota conditions, meaning that it has both drought tolerance and really strong winter hardiness. That third bullet point is admittedly more old wives' tale than it is hard science. There is some anecdotal evidence out there that it is a natural deer deterrent, where deer don't like the scent and the taste associated with the vegetation of creeping thyme. Dutch white clover is another species that does extremely well within bee lawns. It has these open, medium-sized blooms that lends itself really well to a great diversity of pollinators. We've seen more than 50 bee species on Dutch white clover alone. It has really high quality pollen, it has really high quality pollen, it has really high quality nectar, and it's even a nitrogen fixer. So it takes atmospheric nitrogen and it fixes it back into the soil, and that's really good for all plants that are growing within a lawn. So you might have noticed that I mentioned some non-native flowers like Dutch white clover, like creeping thyme. I think it's really important to look at some experts in the field and their opinions on these flowers, especially as it relates to including them in a lawn. So Neil Samardzija from the National Park Service is quoted as saying, "Dutch white clover has been in the US for a long time and is more or less naturalized. I generally don't see it outcompeting native species." The Minnesota Landscape Arboretum has a similar quote where they say, "While non-native flowers may be aggressive, they can still be very useful. Dutch white clover, Trifolium repens, and creeping thyme, that should say Thymus serpyllum, are two species that benefit pollinators and will flower in a mowed lawn." I think that first quote is really interesting because what Neil does is he makes a distinction between naturalized plants and invasive plants. Both are types of non-natives, but it's important to note that different non-natives function in different ways. A naturalized plant is a non-native plant that can coexist and will not outcompete native species, whereas an invasive plant is competitive to the point where it can outcompete the species that's trying to co-establish with. Both Dutch white clover and creeping thyme are naturalized plants, meaning that they can coexist with other native vegetation. Another species that we've seen success with, but isn't included in all bee lawn mixes, is common violet. Common violet is a beautiful flower that blooms early in the season. It has white or purple blooms blooming from April through June. It does really well in both sun and shade. And what's really great about this flower from a pollinator's perspective is that it's a host plant. And when I say host plant, what that means is that there's lots of pollinators, specifically lepidopterans, butterflies, moths, and skippers, that like to lay its eggs on common violet. So even if the quality of the forage is just so-so, its value as a host plant is extremely important. Here's just a beautiful picture of common violet naturalized in a lawn in Minneapolis. I think it adds gorgeous color and it provides great value to wildlife as well. So now I want to run through a little installation example for a bee lawn. And what I'm going to show you right now is an example as what we call an overseeding, where rather than doing a full lawn renovation where you remove the turf grass and then drop the seed, all you have to do is cut your turf grass really low and establish your seed right over the top. So do note that this is only going to work if you have the proper turf grass species, where this only works if you have either fine fescue or Kentucky bluegrass in your lawn. And it's worth noting that the species included in this mix, they are not competitive to the point where they're going to outcompete a really weedy lawn. So if you've got a lawn that's infested with creeping Charlie or common plantain or other aggressive weeds, an overseeding likely will not work perfectly. So step one for an overseeding is to mow the lawn as short as possible. Directly after the mowing event, what you want to do is you want to rake away those clippings. And your goal here is to expose as much soil as possible. When we drop that bee lawn seed down, we want it to make contact with the soil bed. We don't want to getting caught up in the turf grass blades. All seeds need seed to soil contact in order to germinate and establish. After you've raked away those clippings, you're finally ready to spread the seed. Some folks like to use compost or sand as a bulking agent when spreading the seed. And from the second you drop the seed up until establishment, you want to make sure that this area is kept nice and moist. So here we implement that same light watering plan, where on day one, we do a heavy watering right after seeding, and each subsequent day, we're doing light and frequent waterings. So at least 2 to 3 times per day, aiming for about 1/4 inch of water applied to the surface in total. As for maintenance for these, what you want to keep in mind is you never again want to mow below 3 inches in height. 3 inches is the height at which these flowers start to bloom. So if we go lower than that, we won't see any flower heads. The 2 mowing regimes I generally recommend are growing your lawn out to 4.5 inches and cutting it back to 3 inches. Or if you're willing to let things go a little bit more wild, so to say, letting your flowers and lawn on the whole grow out to 6 inches and cutting back to 4 inches. And please do try to refrain from using herbicides. These will kill your flowers. If you see something you really don't like, try to hand weed it. So Angie, before I go into perennial ground cover, it looks like we've gotten a big slew of questions. So I'm happy to take those at this time.
Some of them I am responding to. There was a question about, is there a website that registers private or public non-traditional lawns? I know that Blue Thumb has been encouraging people to map their projects. I don't know how many of those are lawns versus, my gut is that a lot of them are going to be Raingardens and pollinator gardens. But I'm just kind of adding in a few locations I know of that are public ones people can visit. There is a question I don't know the answer to. Do you know with sedges, are they tolerant of dog urine?
Wow, that's a great question.
Yep, I don't know the answer to it.
Honestly, dog urine is extremely difficult across the board. I've never been to a University of Minnesota turfgrass field day where someone didn't ask about dog urine. And honestly, the truth when it comes to dog urine is the issue associated with it is the sheer amount of nitrogen that's being dumped onto the surface. Where if your dog goes consistently in the same spot, that area is likely to be nutrient loaded, and it's going to be really difficult for the vegetation, whether it's a native grass or a turf grass, to get established. What you can have some success with is, and this is probably a pain in the butt, is when your dog goes out to pee on the lawn, if you can dilute it by immediately applying water, that will give your vegetation, whether it's turf grass or a native grass, a better chance of surviving.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's all. The rest are all just me responding.
Okay, sounds good. So with the bee lawns, with the flowering lawns, that was kind of a nice middle ground between what do humans want from a lawn and what do our wildlife and pollinators want from a lawn, where the area is still you can still have plenty of recreation on it. It still looks aesthetically similar, but you're just putting in some low-growing flowers for your pollinators. When it comes to perennial ground cover, here we're really making a more drastic change. So if you are a resident where your lawn area is currently receiving low traffic and you don't use it very much, this is where we think perennial ground cover is a great option. Where if you're the family that uses the lawn for games and picnics and all sorts of use, then you want to retain that functionality. But if you have a low use area, then we think that a great option is to donate this area to the local ecosystem, to pollinators, wildlife, etc. One of the benefits to perennial ground cover is you'll be able to greatly reduce maintenance. Established wildflowers do not need inputs of fertilizer. They don't even need very much water. They're very, very sustainable. All you have to do is maybe weed a couple times a year. We'll talk about that. And what you have to convince yourself is, are you okay with a non-traditional look? Are you okay with a lawn full of beautiful wildflowers rather than traditional turf grass? So some questions to ask yourself. How much foot traffic does my lawn receive? An area where we consider this in particular is boulevards. So ask yourself, does my boulevard receive winter salt from the road? Does it get baked by the summer sun? Here, this doesn't mean you can't have a perennial lawn. In fact, the perennial lawn actually could be great for these conditions. Where it's going to make an impact is species selection, where if it gets baked by the summer sun, you're going to want to use very drought-tolerant species. If it receives winter salt, you're going to want to have species that have really nice salt tolerance. We encourage you to also really think critically about your soil type. The species that do well in sand are very different from the species that do well in clay. Just another reason to get your soil tested. And across the board, the most successful plantings will take these questions into account. Site planning, thinking critically about your project will always pay dividends. So health strips are a very common area where we encourage these practices, where we encourage using perennial wildflowers rather than traditional turf grass. And the reason for that is, as the name indicates, it's so difficult to get turf grass to grow here. Most turf grasses don't have great salt tolerance. If you are selective with your wildflowers, if you use highly resilient species like a pale purple coneflower or a world milkweed or a butterfly weed, or even like a prairie smoke or a pussy toes, those have really nice salt tolerance. They can take that salt that's associated with winters in Minnesota and still establish and look beautiful. Challenging slopes are another great area to consider using wildflowers. When trying to establish turf grass here, it can be so difficult to do this from seed, where so much of that seed is going to slough off if we have a wind event or a rain event. Whereas with wildflowers, you could simply plug those plugs of wildflowers into the ground and they're good to go. Also, it's so difficult to mow sloped areas. So if you want to reduce your mowing along the sloped area of your home, using perennial wildflowers is a great option. Along right of ways, and here I would really want to shout out MnDOT, the Minnesota Department of Transportation. It's becoming increasingly popular to establish either low input turf or wildflowers along right of ways, and that's because they're so low maintenance. They're so much easier to take care of, and because of the value that they provide to our ecosystems and society. So some types of plantings to consider here. So one is a native plant pocket planting. And this here is thinking about, where can I transition some of my turf to a small garden? Any section of your lawn will do, whether it's 5 square feet, 25 square feet, or even if you want to make a larger change, 100 square feet. This native plant pocket planting is really just code name for transitioning your lawn to some sort of native garden. For installation, since these are generally smaller plantings, we do recommend that you use organic site preparation, something like a sheet mulching or a solarization, or even just the good old-fashioned way using a shovel or a sod cutter. Any place where you're removing the turf grass and replacing it with native wildflowers is a fantastic example of how you can create a pollinator-friendly, eco-friendly lawn alternative in your garden. Alternative in your garden. One option that we would really like to highlight is rain gardens, where if you want to take native plantings and go even a step further, A rain garden is just a variation of a native planting where you excavate a little bit of soil. You dig out a little bit of soil. And what this will do is it'll help the planting capture additional stormwater runoff. Here in Minnesota, so many of our beautiful lakes are actually contaminated. So if we wanted to reduce the contamination, if we want to improve the water quality of our local lakes, rivers, streams, etc., rain gardens help to capture so much of that stormwater runoff and the gunk that comes along with stormwater runoff. If there's one thing that I want to highlight with regards to rain gardens, it's that you really want to make sure you have a flat bottom. That'll help to make sure that water infiltrates evenly throughout the planted area. So I do want to share a little bit of a video on rain garden installation. Sometimes it can be intimidating to install a rain garden, but this is actually something that is a little easier than you may think. So let's look at the process together. So you start by digging out the edges. You'll see the individual is using a sod cutter, kind of just a foot-powered blade to remove that turf grass. Next, you start by digging out the basin. The basin is the center area of the rain garden that's flat. That's where your water is going to infiltrate. Once the basin is dug out, you're going to work on what's called the side slopes. The side slopes are where water enters the rain garden, and they're constructed in a very specific manner. We call them 3-to-1 side slopes. That's because for every 3 inches you go towards the center, you go 1 inch down. Once you have your soil ready, you mulch the area, and then you set out your plants. I've made the mistake of putting my plants directly in the ground. Definitely space them out beforehand. Sometimes we get a little overzealous and forget to plan this part out. Once the area is mulched, you put the plants directly into the soil. This is very easy. I did a 150 square foot garden the other day in maybe 30 minutes. Planting is the fun and easy part. After you install the plants, I can't tell you how important this is. So they're digging out a little inlet there, a little inlet where water can enter. But what the individual did right there, make sure the area gets moisture immediately. Native plants need water to survive, especially in that first year after establishment. Water directly after planting, and try to make sure the area receives at least 1 inch of water each week until fully established. Another area where we think this is a really great idea, and I talked about this a little bit, are health strips or in boulevards. The reason for this is boulevards, as they're constructed traditionally, are a little bit of an environmental kind of nightmare, so to say, where your typical boulevard is 1 mounded and 2 planted with turf grass. This creates a perfect situation for stormwater runoff. Because turf grass has such low root systems, and because they're mounded, it's really easy for water to run off right over the top of a mounded boulevard. What we recommend to many residents is to create a boulevard garden or a boulevard bioswale. Here, what you do is you excavate a little bit of soil, just 2 to 3 inches below the curb cut and the sidewalk. And rather than planting the area with turf grass, install native plants. They have really deep root systems, which will help for infiltration. And of course, the native wildflowers are going to be great for your pollinators. And in my opinion, at least, they're so much more beautiful than just a monoculture of turf grass. This boulevard that we have here is a beautiful wild strawberry boulevard garden in North Minneapolis. So how do we actually install these? Step 1 is to strip away the turf. I often like to rent machinery when I'm doing this, especially with the amount of soil that gets removed when installing a boulevard bioswale. So we remove that with a dingo or a skid steer, or if you're feeling really bold, you can go about doing this with a shovel and a sod cutter. Once that soil and turf is removed, you want to shape the boulevard, and as you shape it, incorporate some compost. Boulevards tend to have really poor soil quality, so incorporating compost to improve soil quality can be your best friend. After you shape the boulevard, you do want to apply some mulch. So do notice that that the soil is about 4 inches below the curb cut. How we reach that final height of 2 inches below the curb cut is because we're applying 2 inches of mulch. So we're 4 inches below with just soil, and then we're adding 2 inches of mulch to bring us to our final height. Mulch is really important for preventing weed infiltration and for keeping the area nice and moist. Once you've done this, then bam, you're ready to install your vegetation. You just clear out the mulch a little bit with your hands and install those plantings. These pictures are from some Boulevard bioswales that Metro Blooms installed right in North Minneapolis with the help of the Mississippi River Green Team. Another planting variation to consider are lakeshore plantings. Lakeshore plantings are so important to focus on because there's generally no barrier between your stormwater runoff and that nearby body of water. There's no sewage system. That runoff is going directly to the lake. So here what you want to do is you want to think critically about the plants that you include. The closer you get to the body of water, the more wet tolerant you want your plants to be. So when we're at the edge of the planting nearest your home, furthest away of the water, you can think about using dry or mesic plants, where mesic plants can tolerate both dry and wet feet. But as you get really close to the body of water, you want plants that really enjoy having wet feet. The second type of plant to consider are pollinator-friendly trees and shrubs. What's really great about pollinator-friendly trees and shrubs is that they have an early season burst of blooms for our pollinators. They're also super low maintenance. So this also helps to create a canopy in your yard where you have different levels of plantings. Something that people also really love about trees and shrubs is there's so many edible options. Cherry trees, plum trees, shrubs like raspberries, blueberries, etc. So lots of benefits associated with trees and shrubs. Something that I think is also worth highlighting is the bloom time of trees and shrubs. So many of these bloom early in the season where there tends to be a dearth of resources available to pollinators. A little how-to on planting a tree. What you want to do here is, step one is to dig the hole as deep, and the key is twice as wide as the root ball you receive. If you think about how tree roots grow, they're just as much lateral, if not more lateral, than they are vertical deep down. So giving space for those tree roots to grow is essential. Make sure that your root ball is not circling. You want to make sure that those roots can grow nice and evenly. You don't want them to be too tangled. So don't be afraid to take a scissor to those or a knife to those to straighten out your root ball. After that, you're ready to put your tree directly into that hole that you've dug out. Make sure that it's at the appropriate height and that it's planted straight. I can't tell you how many trees I've passed driving along Larpenteur that are at an angle, at a diagonal. That is a major health concern. So try to plant your tree as straight as possible. As you backfill the hole with soil, you want to periodically water. What this will do is it'll reduce air pockets and it'll help to ensure that the tree establishes successfully. The fourth planting type to consider is a pollinator meadow. And this is kind of like a variation of the native pocket planting. But rather than just selecting a small portion of your yard, here, if you have a low-use yard, you're dedicating your entire lawn area or a large portion of it to native wildflowers. We've had some lawns to legumes participants do this, and it's produced really beautiful results that are going to be fantastic for wildlife. So in doing this, you're essentially turning your lawn area into a native prairie or a native meadow. It is important to check city restrictions, as some cities are not as tolerant as others. But we're starting to see an increase in acceptance of these, as now folks are starting to see that these are great for our ecosystem, they're great for sustainability purposes, and they're really great for supporting our pollinators. Here what we do is we recommend transitioning from turfgrass to a mixture of native grasses and perennial wildflowers. And while this does take a little bit of a commitment in terms of time and investment of money, this will maximize ecological impact. It is fantastic for your pollinators and wildlife. We recommend doing a project of this size, bite by bite, meaning don't go crazy and try and do an acre at a time. Try and do this 50, maybe 100 square feet at a time, and add to it over the long haul. If you do try and do this all at once, you scrape it all, we recommend trying to use an organic site preparation method like a sheet mulching or a solarization. And when you go about installing the plants, try and use a mixture of seeds, plugs, and larger plants. Seeds are a great option because they're the most cost-effective option, but they are also the slowest to come to bloom. Larger plants are the most expensive, but they do give you more immediate blooms. Plugs are kind of that nice middle ground where they're like the teenagers of plants, and they're not quite as expensive as larger plants, but they also come to bloom faster than seeds. So after you do all this installation, it's really important to think about maintenance as well. Oh, excuse me, a little bit on installation. So for installing one of these native wildflower gardens, you are still removing that sod, you're removing that turf grass. We recommend the use of either a sod kicker or a sod cutter. A sod kicker, you can rent it at a local ready rent. It's just a blade that runs underneath the turf. It's like $25 for a day. A sod cutter, if you're working with a larger area and you need something a little bit more heavy duty, sod cutters can range anywhere from an $80 one for the most simple sod cutter to a few $100s for a day for something that's real heavy duty. Some cultural techniques that exist for removing turf grass include solarization. Solarization, you're typically laying a clear plastic along the area that you want to renovate. That area is going to collect heat over time until the vegetation underneath the plastic dies. That generally takes about 2 or 3 months. Then you pull back the plastic, you rake away the dead vegetation, and you have a new area to plant into. I do recommend getting a soil test before planting. It'll let you know if you need any soil amendments. Sheet mulching is a really great process to use as well. Don't try and memorize this right now. When you go back through your recording, this is a great reference slide that summarizes the steps associated with sheet mulching. So I will talk about them kind of one at a time. So the first step to a sheet mulching is to cut it down. Cut that turf grass as low as possible. You can leave the vegetation, you could leave the cuttings. What you want to do is to remove any larger woody material. So step 1, cut the turf grass as low as possible. Step 2 is adding a soil amendment. Molasses is highly recommended because it's so good for soil biodiversity, so the microorganisms that exist within the soil. We recommend a 1/4 cup of molasses mixed with 2 gallons of water per 300 square feet. The next step is adding the compost. You want to add somewhere between a 1/4 inch of compost to 1 inch of compost for that first layer of compost that you put down. Next, you're adding in the cardboard or some sort of material that's going to degrade down over time and really add to your new soil layer. Lots of folks use cardboard, lots of folks use newspaper. Either are fine options. Try to layer it nice and thick, 2 to 3 layers of cardboard. If you're using newspaper, even a few more. Make sure that these areas are nice and dense and overlapping such that there's no bare spots, and give it a dense, thorough watering to ensure that it's holding in place firmly. After you put down the cardboard, add 1 more layer of compost about 1 inch thick. If you do this late in the season, some folks like to use a cover crop that will last through the winter, then die back, and then you can add whatever wildflower mix it is you want to use for the long haul. I am going to talk just a little bit about herbicides. So herbicides, we like to think of them as your absolute last resort. Well, if all else fails, you have no other way of getting your site ready for whatever alternative planting you use, then it is okay to consider some herbicides. Just try to be selective. So some natural or safe herbicides that do exist are acetic acid, products where eugenol is the active ingredient, citric acid. What I would recommend you do is try to refrain from using broad spectrum pesticides. Broad spectrum pesticides tend to be bad for nearby wildflowers. They tend to be bad for nearby pollinators and wildlife communities, even for humans in some cases. So if you have to use herbicides, try and be very selective of what you use. And remember that these should be viewed as your absolute last resort. So once you have the vegetation that you don't want removed, then you're ready to replenish and amend your soil. So soil, I like to call it the newest frontier of biology. We used to think of vegetation as the foundation for our ecosystems. We're learning more and more just how important soil is. So if you want to remediate your soil, if you conduct a soil test and it tells you that you need to do some remediation, you need to put in some sort of additive, we highly recommend using compost. Compost is decayed organic matter that functions similar to a fertilizer. The main difference is that compost, especially food scrap and yard waste compost, they have lower nutrient compositions and they really focus on bringing back the organic matter. Minnesota soils are very nutrient rich, so we don't need those nutrients, and it's important to focus on the organic material instead. If we add more nutrients, we run the risk of that running off during rain events and contributing to eutrophication algal blooms. Also, as you're starting to get your plants installed, we recommend decompacting the soil. This goes double for boulevards, where boulevards tend to have highly compacted boulevards. And when a soil layer is compacted, it's very difficult for roots to penetrate. The picture on your left shows roots trying to penetrate through compacted soils. On the right, you can see how much more easily they're able to penetrate in decompacted soils. In terms of thinking about the importance of soil, this is what I'm talking about when I say that soil is our newest frontier, where soil is in fact a part of the food web, where the soil feeds our plants feed our herbivores, and that carries on through higher and higher trophic systems. So if we really want to support a healthy ecosystem, if we want to support a healthy food web, it truly does start in the soil and all the biodiversity and microorganisms that live in that soil. I think it's also really interesting to think about just how much diversity exists within our soil. So in one, I believe this is per teaspoon of soil. Yes, so for every teaspoon of soil, there's 100 million to a billion bacteria. There's several meters worth of fungi. There's thousands of protozoa. There's 10 to 20 nematodes. And there's also different sorts of arthropods and earthworms. In prairies, you see even more life within healthy soil. So if we create healthy soils, we create really great ecosystems for those microorganisms that support higher trophic levels. Compost tea is a great additive to consider adding to an area that you want to plant. Compost tea is like the liquid form of compost. It is really great for soil quality and the microorganisms that live in your soil. If you're thinking about transitioning to turfgrass, and you don't want to use fine fescue, you want something that'll green up a little bit faster, there are some fine fescue sods. Another option that exists as an alternative to fine fescue, and I know I'm kind of abruptly jumping back to turfgrass now, tall fescue is a really great option that greens up quickly. Sod can be pulled up by wildlife, so just be careful of that if you go about installing turfgrass. So now we're kind of in the maintenance and questions that exist for each of these planting options. So when doing the low-mow options, these are some considerations to have. And as it comes to ongoing maintenance, if you're going with a low-mow mix or a B-lawn mix, you're going to want to think critically about your mowing heights. So you're going to want to use a mower that has adjustable heights, and you're going to want to mow your lawn a little bit higher. Most lawns in Minnesota we let them grow out to 3 inches and we cut them back to 2 inches. With a B lawn and with a low input lawn, there's 2 mowing regimes we want to consider. One, letting it grow out to 4.5 inches and cutting back to 3 inches, or letting it grow out to 6 inches and cutting back to 4 inches. This is much more sustainable. Here's what that looks like. So we're going from about a 6-inch height on the left to about a 4-inch height on the right. There are some issues that exist with no-mow lawns. The primary one that you want to be cognizant of is that thatch buildup is a reality. Thatch is that area of dead vegetation between your turf and between the soil. So what we recommend there is just doing a spring dethatching once per year. After dethatching, there are some gappy areas, some areas that aren't looking perfect. Consider installing some more seed in those problematic areas. So now we're going to transition to the maintenance of native plantings. And by far and away, the most important thing to do is water. When a planting is new, and when a native planting is new, it absolutely needs water. We recommend at least 1 inch of water per week. Of course, pulling weeds is important, especially when the planting is new. And as best as you can, you want to keep the area clear of debris and other trash. Mulch is extremely important to the health of a native planting. It helps keep the area moist. It helps to limit weed infiltration. So check on your mulch, try to replace it at least once every 2 years. So some tips and tricks when it comes to maintaining your area. We recommend trying to weed at least 3 times per season. Some really good timestamps of when to weed is once on or near Memorial Day, once on or near Independence Day, and once on or near Labor Day. This does a really good job of capturing your early, mid, and late season weeds. It's also very important to just simply be observant within your newly planted native area. So if you went with that third option of planting perennial wildflowers, it's a given that some species are going to do really well and some might struggle. So just try to look at your planted area, think critically about which species are surviving, and when you're selecting replacement plants for the species that are struggling, try and think about the conditions of the plants that are doing really well. If you see that your if you see that your full sun dry soil plants are really taking off, try to choose replacement plants with those similar features. Mulch as needed, and cutting back. So deadheading and cutting back your plants at the end of the season is highly recommended. Cutting back your plants will help to ensure that it can grow successfully at the start of the next growing season. And deadheading is the practice of cutting back last year's flower heads such that newer, healthier flower heads can come about in the following year. Oh, one last note about cutting back those stems. After you cut back the height of your wildflowers to a height of about 18 inches or so, keep those stems in your garden. Native bees will use them as a nesting site. About 1/3 of our native bees in Minnesota are stem nesting bees, so they view those stems that are in the ground as home. So some useful resources, some folks that helped to make this possible. I want to thank our Blue Thumb partners, including Organic Bob, and of course the Bowser, the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. Someone asked about turf, where they could find seed. If you look at this link right here, turf.uofm.edu/purchasing turfgrass seed, that will answer any and all questions you have related to where you can find low input seed. It also has information for buying bee lawn seed. These are some references that were used to make today's presentation. Feel free to explore these based on the topic that's most interesting to you. And actually, I don't know, Angie, do you give these folks surveys? This is honestly a slide that's left over from.
No,
Okay, so
I
don't worry about this.
Don't worry about it. I'm not gonna make you.
Yeah, so don't worry about surveys. When we do other Blue Thumb workshops, we do give surveys after the fact, but don't worry about it. So at this time, I'll answer any questions that came in, Angie.
Yeah. So there are a couple of questions. One was related to clover lawns and how often to mow a clover lawn or a bee lawn, if that's the option you went with.
Yes, I follow the same mowing regime that we use for a low input lawn, where I either let it grow out to 4.5 inches, back down to 3 inches if you want kind of the more traditional aesthetic. If you don't mind having something a little bit taller, you'll actually see more flowers, which is great for your pollinators, if you let it grow out to 6 inches and cut back to 4 inches. So that's personally what I would do. But if you want something a little bit more familiar, a little more traditional, then going from 4.5 to 3 is absolutely fine.
Okay. There was a question about using brewer waste as compost. I've not any experience with that. Is that one that you would recommend or have any experience with?
Did you say brewer waste?
Like brewer's waste, like that. I know there's like the yeast and I mean, I always just get usually bulk compost myself, that I get a pickup truck and go drive to a place and get it, get it as cheaply as possible. But yeah, just some questions about options for that.
Yeah, I'm generally
okay.
I've never done it. I generally use compost. I don't know enough about it, quite frankly.
Yeah, I don't either. I just thought I would ask you in case you do. There's a question that I think I can hit up here about when to pull the stems and clean up in the spring so as not to hurt the bees. I have always heard that you wait until the daytime temperature is consistently above 50 degrees during the spring, and that's when it is safe to clear out those gardens. So it's not when the snow first melts, it's a little bit later. You'll start feeling antsy. I always do. And then finally it's time.
The timestamp that I use personally is once you see your dandelions in full bloom, that's kind of a great indicator of degree day accumulation. So the how much warmth has accumulated, and that's what bees respond to as well. So bees emerge around the same time that our dandelions start to bloom. So that's a really good timestamp you could use.
Yeah. I'm just going to go ahead and click down. I know that you mentioned several resources that will really help people. And like I said, I'm going to send out an email tomorrow to everybody who was registered for the workshop, whether or not you were able to attend, and have links to these things in there. I did want to highlight a couple of resources specifically for folks either in Washington County or over on the east side of town. If you are lucky enough to live in Washington County, we do offer free site visits through the Washington Conservation District, and can have a staff person come out and provide you with, a half an hour to an hour long consultation about native gardens, rain gardens, converting to a bee lawn. They will also be able to tell you if there are any watershed district cost share grants that you would qualify for. We have a number of watershed districts that offer grants to incentivize projects that reduce runoff pollution and help to protect lakes and rivers. So if you are interested in doing a shoreline planting or a rain garden, you can very likely get a grant and also design assistance from our office that would be somebody who could help you just with, all these kinds of questions of where should I place it? What plants should I put in there? They might even be able to do a planting plan for you, and direct you to local retailers and contractors that you can work with. So James already talked about the Blue Thumb website. If you wanted to see some local examples in Washington County, we do have some photos of that on our Washington Conservation District website in the Planting for Clean Water area. I mentioned that there are watershed district grants out in Washington County specifically. So we have 8 different watershed management areas, and all of them do have some variation on a plant grant or cost share program. So some of them are rather small. They might offer $250 for you to basically just go out and buy the plants yourself and get started, or buy the seed to get started. And others, if it's something like a big project, a shoreline planting, might be able to offer a substantially larger amount of money, somewhere more like $3,000 to $5,000. And then lastly, I will also include this in the email that I send out tomorrow. But there are county contacts from most of the counties that I think are represented in the metro area, at least for people who are attending today. And quite often they will have similar programs to what we have in Washington County. So you can definitely feel free to reach out to them and inquire if they're able to do site visits or if they have local recommendations in that regard. Okay, so let's see. I think there are a few more. Who would pass up a free visit? Yeah, we give out lots of them. my coworkers always, they kind of dread when I have these workshops, and then the next day they get inundated with all the site visit requests. So on that note, do be patient, because we are a relatively small office, and so it does take a while for people to get around to doing the site visits. Let's see. Yep. Okay. Yes. And plenty of people saying that they have benefited from the grants in the past too. Okay. Here is a question. Sorry, just rolling through. I've tried to seed white clover several times in the dog area, but nothing comes up. What can I do? Got any ideas, James?
I think this is just the
I'm
gonna probably parrot myself, where dog urine, it's just so much nitrogen being applied where it's just really difficult. I genuinely don't know what to do in an area that a dog is using consistently. It's really difficult to get plants to grow with that much nitrogen.
Yeah. I did, in response to an earlier question, drop a link into a list of salt tolerant plants that is on the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency website, and also a link to plants that are native plants that are well suited for sunny, dry sites. And I would say any of those are going to be good ones for drought tolerance as well, because that's basically what they're designed to do. So, yeah. How and where do you get a soil test done? That's through University of Minnesota Extension, and I will include a link to the soil test homepage where you can download that kit. If you're in another state, it's going to be likely through their extension program. We got mulch that was full of weeds. Where would you look for clean mulch?
Ooh. My go-to has always been Kern Landscaping, but there's lots of places to get it. I would ask the garden center if they inspect their mulch. A good garden center will. But yeah, I'll give a shout out to Kern. Kern Landscaping is a great local Blue Thumb partner.
Yeah, that's great. Can clover grow in the deep shade?
It probably prefers part shade, deep shade. I mean, honestly, pollinators don't like to forage in deep shade. They are ectotherms. They need sunlight to retain, their body temperature. So I would say just go with a shade tolerant plant, whether it's fine fescue or some shade tolerant wildflower. I wouldn't worry too much about clover or a pollinator friendly species in particular in the shade, because for the most part, pollinators don't like to forage there anyways. But fine fescue is always my go-to. When I see shade, the first question I ask myself is, oh boy, I better make sure that weeds don't grow here, because I know the creeping Charlie is dying to get into the shady parts of an open lawn.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great. A shout out to Gertens if you are in the Washington County area. Yep, great compost and mulch. Okay, folks. Like I said, I will send out some resources. I will post this recording to our Conservation District YouTube channel and send out a link to that as well. So I know there was, there's always lots of people who register and aren't able to attend, or sometimes you just want to be able to look back at the slides and, pick out some of that information that was hard to pick up during the workshop. So James, thank you so much for sharing all your expertise with us. That was really great. And thank you everybody else for joining us tonight. And, feel free to keep in touch. And once I send an email, you'll know how to get a hold of me. And so then you can, follow up with any other additional questions as well.
And Angie, feel free to share my email with anyone who has any withstanding questions. Always happy to help.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, everyone, well, have a great night and go do your dinner or whatever the thing is that you've got next on your agenda, okay? All righty.